Thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted and honored to be here today to talk about the 1860 Japanese Embassy in connection with this lovely exhibit, Building Bridges, here at Lancaster History. So today I'm going to speak about the first samurai to visit the White House and the interactions of these samurai with President Buchanan and Harriet Lane and the American people. This research is based on the analysis of close to 2,000 newspapers, several hundred journals, letters, all sorts of exciting primary sources. So I'm really excited to be able to share all of this work with you today. These samurai and the idea of Japan influenced American culture, influenced American intellectual history before the American Civil War. And that's something I'm very excited to share with you today in ways that the government of Japan and the government of America could not have predicted. I believe we are also being joined today on Zoom by some people from Japan. So thank you very much for joining at this very early hour. お忙しい中、参加していただき、本当にありがとうございます。Let's get started. In 1860, the first ever Japanese embassy to the United States came to America. I want to set the stage with what's happening in the United States and in Japan during this time. So in 1860, most Americans had never met a Japanese person. Most Americans had never seen a Japanese person. The first wave of Japanese immigration to California and Hawaii, which was not part of the US at the time, but those waves of immigration did not begin until the mid 1880s. Early Chinese immigrants came to America in the late 18th century and had this kind of large wave in the early 19th century. But with the exception of a kind of unusual shipwrecked Japanese teenager who grew up in Connecticut, for the most part, there were not Japanese immigrants in the United States in this year, 1860. So in the antebellum American mindset, Japan is a kind of mysterious and exotic place of increasing importance, which we'll get to in a moment. President James Buchanan entered office in 1857, and as many of you know, the nation is facing a variety of challenges. Over 4.5 million people were enslaved and enduring unspeakable horrors. National unity was increasingly fractured over different visions of America's future. What's happening in Japan? So some of you may have heard about these expeditions of Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853 and 1854. These are often celebrated as the so-called opening of Japan, but Japan had actually never been truly isolated. Japanese people had been engaging in social relations, in trade, in all sorts of cultural exchange with all different types of people for centuries. People from the Ryukyu Islands, people from Ezo, which is now a part of Japan, Spain, China, Netherlands, Russia, Korea, many places centuries before Perry's arrival. But for most American writers in 1860, Perry's expedition represented this symbolic opening of Japan, a diplomacy that was made possible using the threat of gunboats. So there's a treaty in 1854, Treaty of Kanagawa, and that sets the stage for the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce that's going to set the 1860 Japanese embassy in motion, and it'll forever reshape Japan. So the 1860 Japanese embassy, it's the first Japanese embassy to visit the United States, but it's also the first Japanese delegation to leave Japan since 1613. Yes, 1613. So a lot of changes are happening. Their goal was to ratify that treaty I just mentioned, the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which, among other conditions, granted American access to certain Japanese treaty ports. And this is a big issue for Americans at the time. The embassy members were split over two ships, the USS Powhatan and the Kanrin Maru. USS Powhatan has the main embassy members who we'll be focusing on today, and the Kanrin Maru has a kind of escort group that's also carrying a variety of gifts and luggage, as well as a backup ambassador in case the USS Powhatan does not succeed in its journey. But fortunately, it did succeed, and after difficult sea voyages, both ships arrived safely in the United States. So here's a map of the USS Powhatan's journey. The embassy journeyed all around the world, and they'll be who we will be focusing on today. After arriving in California, crossed Panama by train. There was no Panama Canal at the time. And then went to DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and then New York before returning on a truly around the world voyage that is outstanding even by today's standards. None of the official delegation members who are a part of this embassy had ever visited the United States before, and almost none of them actually spoke more than a few words of English. So it's a really interesting setup for this encounter. That Kanemaru, the second ship that goes to California, and then will return to Japan, but won't join for this trip around the world. So we're talking about samurai today. The word samurai is usually translated as warrior. And if you've seen kind of samurai films or the recent hit TV show Shogun, you might have a very particular image in your mind about what a samurai is or what a samurai is doing. But the samurai of the mid-19th century were very different than the samurai of previous centuries. So by this time, there had been essentially no wars in Japan for over 250 years. Samurai are still training in martial skills, but being a warrior is not necessarily the main occupation. 19th century samurai could have all sorts of jobs. They could be working as accountants for their lords, different kinds of, chef. You could be a samurai dentist, and we have some of those men on this trip. So many things that they're doing that are not necessarily, blood drenched on a battlefield during the 19th century. For these 1860 Japanese embassy members, their service entailed this very dangerous and unprecedented journey around the world. And this key date, 1860, both countries are headed towards their own respective civil wars. So it's a really interesting time for Japanese and American people to get their first-hand look at each other on American soil. So from the moment the Japanese arrived, they were celebrated and heralded as this great power and potential trade partner. Newspapers described the Japanese as the British of Asia. This was a quote that was often used. The Japanese are the British of Asia. And newspapers exhorted the American people to do everything in their power to make the Japanese feel welcome, to get them excited about American culture, and to emphasize this idea that the future of American commerce rested on the opinions of America that these Japanese embassy members would take with them to Japan. So here is one of my favorite images of the 1860 Japanese embassy. There are so many people to see them that you can't actually see the embassy members themselves. But let me see if I can get this going. There we go. So we have the embassy members in carriages. They're protected by guards from these enormous crowds, which are large even by present-day standards. And this is a picture of them on their procession into New York. There's many wonderful details with this image. What I like, perhaps, besides the fact that people are so excited, they are hanging off of the roof of a life insurance building, which is marvelous. You can feel the excitement that this is the biggest thing to happen in the summer of 1860. It's a little bit difficult to tell in these kind of older photographs, but if you look closely, you'll see that outside these windows, there we go, are small Japanese flags. And the embassy members wrote in their journals about their both being touched and impressed, and also very pleased to see in all these different places they went that there were different Japanese flags being hung outside of windows. There were large signs saying "Welcome Japanese." Some attempts at writing Japanese, which we'll see how that went. But overall, a large effort made to welcome these embassy members. So something really wonderful, I think, to see. The Americans dragged the often exhausted samurai to a variety of celebrations, to theatricals, to the opera, to see examples of industry at work, to the shipyard, to a variety of balls and nighttime parties. They took them to magic shows, basically all sorts of events, anything they could think of, desperate both to show the Japanese off to the curious American public who wanted to see these distinguished strangers. And the Japanese were most often called the distinguished strangers from across the seas. So people wanted to see the distinguished strangers, but the government also wanted to show off to the Japanese what America saw as the best of itself. So there's this real effort to kind of show all the great things about America. This is an illustration of a ball given in honor of the Japanese. And you can see the level of people crammed in. This is not exaggeration for illustrative purposes. There are many charming and strange stories of people resorting to all sorts of schemes to try to get tickets into these balls, which were really the highlight of the social season in June 1860. Some people trying to pretend like they could play instruments and coming in as part of the band. People promising tickets to relatives. All sorts of really strange but wonderful connections happening. And people were coming from different cities to try to see the Japanese. All over, people were making journeys to get closer. There were so many people in that one that you almost cannot even see the Japanese. But I wanted to draw it here. You see one here, and more. Oh, there we go. And you can see people kind of leaning in with excitement. So a lot of excitement for the Japanese. May 17th, 1860, the samurai come with the treaty box to the White House. There was a lot of excitement surrounding the treaty box and the symbolism of this new relations with the United States and Japan, and this great celebration. So here they're going to. They were staying at Willard's Hotel in Washington, D.C., which still exists today. So you can imagine the samurai and their surprise when they meet President Buchanan, because they see a man who is dressed in a suit that looks very much like the suits of other men. No one is bowing to him when he walks. The White House was different by even our standards. So this was a time when the American president could walk down the street without guards. And this was something that was just not imaginable in Japan. Many of the embassy members commented on the fact that American men would pass him and they did not bow. Sometimes they would tip their hat, but no bowing, which was very strange. In comparison, this is Edo Castle. Let me see if I can get this going. So we have Edo Castle here, about 10 main inner section and also an outer section, comprising about 10 miles. If you ever get a chance to go to Japan, you'll see remains of Edo Castle today, but they seem much smaller because this is what we have left. But still very, very grand. Yeah, outer perimeter of about 10 miles, a big chunk of what is now Tokyo. There were even more surprises in store for the embassy during their time in the United States. Japanese at the time, for kind of religious reasons, did not regularly eat red meat. So when they came and experienced the American diet with all sorts of dishes covered in sauces and gravies, boiled tongue served just for them, some of them had a rough time. But Americans were determined to be hospitable, and so they prepared rice and generously covered it with butter and sugar. So many of the samurai had a very homesick and painful experience during their time in the U.S. Although champagne and ice cream were big hits, and these men were some of the first Japanese men to eat ice cream and champagne. But on a more serious note, the Japanese were deeply surprised by the presence of women at American political events. Here's another entrance of them going to the White House. Okay, so here's an image of the reception of the Japanese embassy. We have President Buchanan, and we have the coming forward with the treaty box and this exchange of ceremony. Ceremony was really important to Japanese politics at the time. But I want to return to this. So the Japanese were very surprised by the presence of women at this incredibly diplomatic event. And if you look, you can see these women standing on chairs in the back to get a closer view. Basically, anyone who could, if you knew some senator who he was your friend, you would try to kind of get a ticket. Well, not a ticket, but try to get access to this. In Japan, it would be inconceivable for the women of the shogun's household to be like dancing with the lords of his lords. That would be very strange. This concept of American social ballroom dancing did not exist in Japan. Of course, there was dancing, but this wasn't something that the shogun is going to do with those who serve him. And this isn't to say that Japanese women weren't influencing politics. There are really interesting histories of women who are engaged in activism in the mid-1800s. But the embassy members as a whole were very distressed by this presence of American women at these gatherings, and at the aggressiveness with which many of these men were pursued by Americans. Yeah, I want to zoom in a little bit so you can see these women. So this excitement for the Japanese was so great. Japanese were pursued very aggressively for autographs, sometimes for physical contact, both by men and women. Some of the samurai recorded in their journals their distress at being physically dragged by women into brothels. Yes, or one samurai who returned to his hotel room after a walk and found an American man trying on all his clothes in his absence. So it's really hard to overstate, how excited people are for the Japanese. American newspapers were very excited. They believed that they were seeing that the embassy was enjoying their stay and appreciating all these different excursions. And many were enjoyed. But the embassy members also had very different interpretations of American culture and American people. Some viewed the behavior, this rowdy mixing of people, regardless of status, regardless of gender, as a sign that America was really not a civilized nation. But there was an exception to this distress, and her name was Harriet Lane. The embassy members recorded overall very positive descriptions of Harriet Lane, the niece of President James Buchanan. So Harriet Lane was 26 during the time of the embassy's visit, and she was perhaps the woman who enjoyed the closest contact with the Japanese during their 25 days in DC, which was the longest time they stayed in one place. We have many in the audience who are very frequent visitors to Lancaster History and President Buchanan's Wheatland, but since we have some joining for the first time today, I'll just give a brief overview. So Lane lived at the White House with President Buchanan, who was unmarried. She was the first lady of the White House and Buchanan's cherished confidant. She was famous for her elegant appearance, which you can get an example of in this image, as well as her glamorous lifestyle and her diplomatic grace. So this is a very tension-filled time in American history. And Lane is skillfully managing White House gatherings with people whose ideals are fundamentally and often violently opposed. So quite an amazing woman. Praise for Harriet Lane appeared in both Northern and Southern publications, and she was also known across the Atlantic. Got a little bit ahead of myself. There we go. In 1855, when Queen Victoria dined with Buchanan, who was then the American minister of England, Queen Victoria recorded her praise of Lane as his really lovely niece, Miss Lane, very ladylike and not at all American. This is great praise coming from the Queen of England. Even samurai, and I'll just go back here. These are kind of the three key ambassadors of this embassy. Ambassador Muragaki in particular, he was very startled by Lane's dominance in the home. He described her as behaving as a type of queen in the way that she was managing affairs. And you can see some wonderful quotes by Muragaki in the exhibit after, if you get a chance. So he was very startled by Lane's direct questions about Japan. But he described Lane as quote, beautiful in face and figure, and described her as a very accomplished person. We don't know what Lane thought about her encounter with Muragaki, but Lane appears to have been a little less affected by the Japanese frenzy than her countrywoman. She wrote to a friend in July 1860, after the Japanese returned to Japan, and wrote, "Did you see the Japanese? If not, you are really a curiosity, for all the women seemed to go daft about them." Some of those women going daft may have included some of Lane's friends. So this is a letter from one of Harriet's friends, Lane's friends, Lily McAllister. 28, Elizabeth Lytle, aka Lily McAllister. She was the daughter of Philadelphian businessman Charles McAllister II, who is would become the namesake of McAllister College in Minnesota. So she stayed with Lane at the White House during the embassy's time in DC, and she wrote several letters to her father about this visit. And I wanted to kind of read this part of this letter, which is, "My friend, the young Prince Tsukahara Jugoro, is very bright and interesting, and asked for my card and to write my name on it, and then gave me his, complimented me through the interpreter on my dancing at the Dutch ministers, and altogether we had quite a little flirtation. He is the son of the richest man in Japan." One of the things I think that is wonderful about this letter is she is so excited by this Japanese connection that she is boasting to her father about this flirtation, and also expects him to share that excitement and to also be impressed. And she's clearly very proud of her role in this a key moment of U.S.-Japan diplomacy, entertaining such important men as the Japanese embassy members. So I love this close relationship she has with her father, that she's sharing these details. She writes other letters as well. She writes a letter to her aunt the following evening describing an event that was held for the Japanese, and she describes it as being like a fairy scene. She writes, "The Japanese appeared to enjoy it immensely. I had an ecstatic time, danced to my heart's content, strolled in the moonlight, but it is not worth it to go into details. Only I am too sorry it is over." And then she talks about it some more and then says, "I will have so much to talk about when I reach home that I shall hardly take time to breathe for a week." So wonderful details. And there are many letters, many that probably have not survived, but many letters throughout the country as people are writing and imagining the Japanese. Lily McAllister and Harriet Lane were this extremely privileged few that actually got to have dinner and these flirtations up in person. Lane's cousin, Harriet Buchanan, was also at the dinner. As I said, anyone who can, you're going to try to get access to these great celebrities. And this is a letter from Harriet Buchanan, so I'll read it here. "I must not forget to tell you my good luck. It is the custom in Japan, when anyone goes to a dinner party, that they should take a present to the host. We were very glad to find that they carried out this custom on Friday. Very soon after they entered the room, they came to Cousin H, Harriet Lane, and handed her 3 boxes, one above the other. She was going to take them all, but they stopped her and signified to her that she was to have only one. Then they presented Miss M, who I think is Miss McAllister, and myself with the others, after which we all bowed our thanks. As they do not consider it polite to open presents before the donors, we're obliged to restrain our impatience until after they left. I'm so glad to have something Japanese to take away with me." So I think this just perfectly captures this excitement for getting a little souvenir of this truly monumental moment in American history. Even though Harriet Buchanan wrote in a different letter, she wrote, quote, "I'm so tired about hearing about them that I cannot write a word more on the subject." She then writes passages and passages because she's this inside source of knowledge about the Japanese. And she also describes, hearing nothing from morning until night but Japanese. But that kind of reluctance disappears 2 weeks later after she gets some Japanese gifts. These impressions and experiences of the Japanese, of course, are unusual. They're very charming, I think. But what I want to draw your attention to is how significant it is, the time in which they are occurring, that this is happening in a time of great division, a time of great prejudice throughout the nation. And in this context, we're having Japanese men in the White House dining with the niece of the American president. Here is in a German publication about Harriet Lane and President Buchanan inspecting the gifts. Even if you couldn't see the gifts up close, you wanted to kind of learn about them through the newspaper. But returning to that, this is actually quite a serious moment as well. McAllister, she's describing the Japanese as, quote, "dignified, well-bred people, as friends, as men of wealth, as men of worth, and as people who should be deeply respected." Women wrote to the Japanese for all sorts of reasons, some out of curiosity to learn about a new culture, a culture they didn't know about before. Some were very worried about the Japanese and wanted to religiously convert them, which caused a lot of problems, but they believed that they were acting in the best interest of these men. Some were quite entrepreneurial and were trying to give the Japanese gifts that they would take home and perhaps make fashionable with the women of Japan. The reasons were really as diverse as the writers themselves. Men, women, children, all sorts of people wrote to and about the Japanese during this time. Um, Lots of different reasons. But one thing that they almost all had in common was the hope of gifts. This is the most exciting thing that has happened in the summer of 1860, but arguably in American history. This is considered a royal visit. America has never hosted a royal before. Now, the samurai were not actually princes, but they were believed to be by American newspapers. The samurai kind of system was a little bit difficult to understand. And there were also likely some American newspapers trying to make them even more of celebrities by emphasizing the aspect of their being princes in disguise. So this is essentially for the American people, a royal visit and the biggest event of the summer of 1860. Harriet Lane, as mentioned, is one of these really privileged few who kind of got a guaranteed access to the Japanese. Everybody else is going to have to fight for it. You can see some gifts and items relating to the Japanese visit in the collection Building Bridges, so please do take a look. It was really wonderful to see these great treasures from Lancaster history on display. I couldn't resist and wanted to share just a few from the collection that have special stories that go with them. So many of the embassy members grew tired of all these Americans chasing them. And so some of them would kind of hide in the hotel and just try to wait out the trip. But one of the samurai wrote in his journal about how they would see beneath the hotel people carrying like buckets and all sorts of things, hoping that someone would throw something from the window, some kind of gift. Gift giving is a big deal in Japanese culture, but you can imagine the stress of some of these embassy members who they knew they had to give some gifts to the president, people connected to the president, but not every American they saw. And so we start seeing some of these kind of improvised gifts. So people, folding, making little butterflies out of paper and then throwing them from the windows. And this quote from the New York Daily Tribune talks about some of these artificial butterflies, which, guided by the motions of a fan, fly about, advance, retreat, appear to sip the honey from flowers, or add in all sorts of 19th century hyperbole, and display all the airs and graces of real butterflies. And many of the embassy members in their journals wrote about this pressure, but also this excitement that Americans had for gifts. President Buchanan is also perhaps the only American president to ever have a Japanese encyclopedia in the White House. Just as there were people trying to give gifts to the Japanese and get gifts from the Japanese, there were also people who were perhaps trying to ingratiate themselves with those who had access to the Japanese. So those officials who were serving the embassy, the kind of military guards, as well as it appears President Buchanan, suddenly started receiving all sorts of gifts from friends who hoped to be remembered. We don't know 100%, the context that was coming behind this gift that arrived, but it can be imagined that, hearing about this upcoming Japanese visit, that someone who knew President Buchanan decides to share this kind of souvenir from his own trip to Japan aboard the USS Susquehanna. So all sorts of people are being connected in this pursuit of all things Japan. So Americans eager for souvenirs of the Japanese visit. Japanese embassy members also brought home souvenirs, especially things like pocket watches, which were not being produced in Japan at the time. Carpet, which was a very expensive fabric. If you were a kind of wealthy man, you maybe would have a piece of carpet the size of a wallet. And so many of them wrote about their surprise at the Willard Hotel, or a room like this where you see, floor-to-floor carpet is really quite something astonishing. But embassy member Morita Okataro Kiyoyuki was very impressed enough with Lane that he brought home his own souvenir. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Here are more images of people photographing the gifts because lots of excitement for them. So here's the image that Morita Okataro brought home. So we see Harriet Lane, and then we have a Japanese inscription. And he writes, "A beautiful woman of America. Her name is Lane." And he describes her pierced ears and bare shoulders, which would have been very kind of unusual in Japan. And I indicated here, but instead of spelling Lane with the kind of syllabary that you would use for foreign words, he combines the character for calm, re, and the character for kind of like glamorous, glamour, like calm glamour becomes kind of her name. This seems especially suiting considering Harriet Lane's reputation for diplomacy and grace. So kind of very special to see this. After the embassy's time in DC, they went north and went one night in Baltimore, 8 days in Philadelphia, and finally 2 weeks in New York. And as the Japanese went north, the frenzy for them grew because now newspapers are having time to circulate and share different stories. At the center of this excitement, oh, and here's a map for you. At the center of this excitement is 17-year-old assistant interpreter Tadeshi Onojiro. He's known as Prince Tommy to the American press, and Tadeshi becomes a national celebrity. Newspapers reported American women sending him love letters, sending him personal portraits, and all sorts of materials. And what I love about this image is you can get an idea of his personality. This is a time when most people don't smile in photos, but here he is. He's got his hand on his hip. He's looking quite sassy, with his uncle / adopted father in the middle and another embassy member named Namura on the side. So Tadeshi was much younger than most of the embassy members, and he was very excited to be part of this adventure. There are reports of him before he left Japan, kind of talking about his excitement. And unlike many of his colleagues who saw it as very important to maintain a kind of severe dignity of Japan, Tadeshi kind of went a different direction. And an example reported in the news was when they went to a firehouse, a fire station. It's a really hot day. All the kids are kind of, hot and tired. And he grabs the fire hose and sprays everyone. And of course, the kids are delighted. Maybe the only diplomat to ever spray children with a fire hose at an event. But that gives you a kind of example of how this is a 17-year-old who's having the journey of a lifetime and really excited about it. What I also like about this image is you get an idea of what the others may have thought of his of his kind of very bold and flirty style. So I'll just mention. So he's the main topic of my book, Civil War Samurai: The 1860 Japanese Embassy and Tadeshi Onojiro in Antebellum America, forthcoming by Leiden University Press in March 2026. So please do stay tuned. He has a really interesting life that I'll touch on briefly today, but there's lots more. So Tadeshi, he inspired numerous poems and songs. I won't sing them for you today, although I could. But here's one of them, the Tommy Polka. And you can see here, dedicated to Tadeshi Onojiro, or Tommy of the Japanese embassy. What's also wonderful about this one is you can see in this image, he's actually wearing Western-style shoes. So he's kind of dressing and enjoying his life in America. There's also there are many other songs. One of them, the Japanese polka. If you come visit me in University of Tennessee-Knoxville, and you can see we have this original here. This is depicting Edo, but spelled with a J, and in this time in America. Yes, so lots and lots of songs, lots of stories. Much enthusiasm for the embassy. But the embassy was more than just a kind of exciting sensation, celebrities in town type of thing. Tadeshi and the Japanese were unlike any men America had ever encountered. They were perceived as aristocratic, as wealthy, as incredibly educated, as an enormous target for female admiration and these kind of heartthrobs, and as having power over the future of American commerce. But they were also not Christian. They were men of color who came from a culture with very different values and, as I said, no Christianity, and culturally non-European. So this combination has never existed before on American soil. So the presence and performance of the Japanese in America is really shaking up ideas about what it means to be a civilized person in antebellum life. What does it mean to be civilized when these different factors are conflated? Now, Tadeshi, his reported friendliness and flirtiness inspired very serious debates about Japanese masculinity, about civilization, about race. All these kind of key issues of 19th century America were really encapsulated in many of the debates about Tadeshi Onojiro. No detail was too small. Here he is taking up the full cover of the New York Illustrated News. Here we have arrival of the Japanese, Tom the merry man of the Japanese, and he was often seen as a kind of mood maker. But no detail was too small. So some newspapers would publish up to 7 articles about the Japanese per issue. The theme tonight is building bridges. So I'm focusing today more on the people who were building bridges, pursuing bridges. But it's also worth mentioning that there were also those who sought to build walls. So American publications, both Northern and Southern, initially welcomed the Japanese and kind of exhorting them to welcome the Japanese. A lot of pride in this perceived desirability of American women. The Louisville Daily Journal writes, His Imperial Majesty is probably afraid that if the members of the embassy once feel the soft hands of our ladies, he will never be able to get them back. And this was seen as a great thing. Look, we'll show them our amazing, the female diplomacy of America, and this will be a great thing. But as the Japanese became more and more popular, as women started behaving a little bit more wildly in their pursuit of these embassy members, the Japanese started posing a serious threat to American assumptions of race and what it meant to be civilized. Towards the middle of an end of June, many of these kind of white-owned metropolitan publications started racially rejecting the idols that they had created in the Japanese. While at the same time, here's very proud initially in their visit about this desirability of this female loveliness that they've never had a chance to see. So we won't go into it in too much detail today, but in my book, I talk about how the 1860 embassy reveals a Japanese influence on the road to the American Civil War, as Northern and Southern newspapers used the Japanese and women's enthusiasm for the Japanese as an example and a lens through which to attest that the North and the South have kind of irreconcilable moral differences. So Japan is influencing America at this time in a way neither government could have expected. But what I love about the 1860 Japanese embassy is that there were samurai and American people determined to pursue connections across all different types of difference, of geography, of language, of culture. In particularly, African-American publications were very excited about the Japanese visit and interpreted it in a different way. The African-American press celebrated this great enthusiasm for the Japanese and the way that they proved the role of civilized gentlemen in state affairs, and at the same time were seen as exposing state hypocrisy in terms of racial prejudice. The embassy members were not taken to slave plantations. They were not taken to places that would be seen as embarrassing in the eyes of the exact quote uses, they do not take them to places that would be embarrassing in the eyes of foreigners. And so this is seen to many African-American publications as proof that the American government instinctually recognizes that slavery is shameful. The Weekly Anglo-African, for example, talks about the Japanese in detail. So the Japanese are a lens through which African-American are presenting the shared quest for racial equality in the face of racial prejudice. So African-American people enduring, even free African-American people enduring daily struggles. So the Japanese dining side by side with the niece of the American president become a real inspirational model. And African-American newspapers start inventing a kind of shared solidarity with Japan, recreating ideas about Japanese history and envisioning that Japanese and Black people in America have this very special connection. Whereas other newspapers would call the Japanese, these white-owned publications called the Japanese the distinguished strangers, the African-American press often called them distinguished brethren, emphasizing this kind of shared connection. There was a mention before, but I can't help. Actually, yeah, here we have an example. And this was this image isn't from the African American newspapers, but they were circulating and seeing all of these images throughout the press at the time. There we go. For those interested in learning more about Black Japanese encounters, as was kindly mentioned, please do check out Black transnationalism in Japan, which looks at the really interesting history between African American and Japanese people. If this type of history interests you, you may also be interested in reopening the opening of Japan, transnational approaches to modern Japan and the wider world, which also takes a look at these different types and alternate so-called openings of Japan and Japanese engagement. Centered around ideas of Japan's opening, building from some of the really innovative research coming out of the Oxford Japanese History Workshop. So please do check it out. So I'll just briefly say here that African American writers generated an imagined solidarity with the Japanese based on a perception of a shared culture, a shared brotherhood, despite these seemingly insurmountable boundaries of language, geography, and culture. So neither government could have really anticipated this wild mania. Women who wrote to and about the Japanese did so for a variety of reasons, as I said. But although many, and children as well, and this is an image I like of a children's festival that was given for the Japanese. We have this girl dancing here, but my favorite girl is actually this one who's being repressed by her mother. She's quite eager to dance and show her stuff for the distinguished guests. Although many of the samurai were distressed with their encounters with American women, overall, their experiences with American children were very positive. And there are really heartwarming letters of children and teenagers reaching out to the Japanese embassy. I'll read a little bit of one. So several young men wrote to the embassy with the hopes of joining the Japanese in their travels. A young man from Connecticut expressed his hopes, quote, of becoming an interpreter or something of that kind. And he talks about how I've been ever been on the watch for a chance to take the first step, which is to get to Japan. And he asks for assistance to help a young man in his efforts to be somebody. Another, a 24-year-old German immigrant, also asked to return to the embassy, with the embassy to Japan. And he talked about how life in Japan had to be better than life in the United States. He says, having arrived now at an age where a man should provide for the future and having no great prospect in view by remaining in this city, for New York is a mighty hard one for a young man. Unfortunately, they did not get to join the embassy, but these are some of the many letters of people seeking a connection. Also, some children very desperate for autographs. Hopefully, they got them. So the Japanese left the United States at the end of June 1860 and returned to Japan in November. Even before Perry arrived, the Tokugawa shogunate was facing a variety of challenges exacerbated by natural disasters and famines. So Perry's arrival was neither the start nor the end of troubles for the Tokugawa shogunate, this government that's ruling Japan. 1860 embassy returns to an even more politically troubled Japan than the one they left. And by 1868, Japan will have a civil war. Meanwhile, in the United States, after the Japanese left, American newspapers celebrate the arrival of a new prince, the Prince of Wales. This is a great excitement, and many newspapers delight in imagining that Tateishi on the boat to Japan is crying. If he would cry if he knew how soon he's forgotten with the Prince of Wales. But truly forgotten people do not continue to make headlines. And discussion of Tateishi continued in American newspapers all through the Civil War. I talk a little bit about it in my book because I think it's mind-blowing to me that in the middle of the American Civil War, there are people who are still thinking about this Japanese teenager who had visited several years before. So we've seen today, in pursuing and discussing the Japanese, American people are engaging with all these key categories of 19th century life, about race, religion, culture. And I talk a little bit more in my book about how they start rethinking some of these key values and concepts that will shape U.S.-Japan relations for the next 150 years. Much of the historiography about early U.S.-Japan encounters focuses on the story of Japan reacting to Perry, and the story of Japan's rush to modernize. But there are other stories present if we take a closer look at how people are engaging on the transnational level, how people are engaging when they're in these unofficial spaces. I think these are stories that show Japan instigating change, instigating new types of ideas in America, and inspiring different groups of people to challenge and reinterpret the worlds in which they lived. And I love this image of we have New York with the Japanese flag flying high. So during one of the most divided and horrific periods in American history, by looking at the 1860 embassy, we can see women who break every convention of their time to pursue encounters with the Japanese and some kind of connection. We can see young people who saw Japan as an inspiration and as a source of hope for the future. And we can see American children admiring Japanese celebrities, dreaming and hoping for the day that they too will get to go to Japan. And of course, we see samurai at the White House as all across America, people are thinking and engaging with Japan. I'll just kind of close out by saying my hope is that the stories of the countless American people who encountered, described, imagined the 1860 Japanese embassy will draw attention to the many other bridges, the many other kind of perhaps still hidden stories of people working together, kind of building bridges across all sorts of perceptions of difference in pursuit of positive futures and alternate visions of what the world might be. Thank you very much.
Folks, if you have any questions, raise your hand and I'll bring you a microphone.
First of all, thank you. That was fascinating, and your enthusiasm bubbles over. I have a general terminology. Talk about them as the Japanese embassy, and I always think of the embassy as the building somewhere, instead of like a delegation. And I just don't know the history of that word, of why it was called a Japanese embassy, because they didn't like stay and set up. If you could explain about that.
Yes. Okay. So embassy, I'm using embassy because just directly translated in Japanese, we'd say shisetsu. So you could translate it also as mission. The most famous one is like known as the Iwakura mission, which would come in 1871. But you're right to say that there was not an embassy in this time, but they do have a plenipotentiary ambassador. So they have three, I think I have the images. They have these kind of three key ambassadors that make it an embassy. But what I actually talk about in my, let me find them. What I talk about in my book, there they are, is there's some really interesting reasons, personally, why I think this 1860 embassy is usually called an 1860 embassy and not an 1860 diplomatic mission, even though it could be both. My view is in a lot of history on Japanese encounters, this 1860 embassy has really been downplayed because people haven't really looked at the significance of how the people are interacting. It's been kind of just, well, they ratified a treaty and okay, well, they did go to the mint and had some serious business there. But embassy has a less sounding of a purpose. But what I kind of draw attention to is that there were all sorts of encounters happening here, even if they didn't have, as you say, a permanent embassy in America at the time, or the same kind of fact-finding mission that later diplomatic missions would have. But yeah, thank you very much.
So what do we know about the stated objectives of the Japanese government of the time in sending the mission to the United States?
Yes. Oh, this is a wonderful question. So what were the goals? The goal was to ratify the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and come home. Unlike later missions, which had the most famous one I just mentioned to the great question before about the Iwakura mission. So this was a very organized fact-finding mission in 1871, where the Japanese government basically sends its a team of kind of government officials, intellectuals, to try to get as much knowledge about the West to kind of aid in these efforts of modernizing. this was not, well, I shouldn't be disrespectful here, but this was not what was happening in 1860. Some of these men did not want to come to America. They were kind of ordered to do so. And so there was less of an organized purpose. They didn't organize themselves saying, we should go check out XYZ. This was much to the frustration of some of my favorite of the samurai embassy members, especially those who were of lower rank and were very frustrated that some of their, well, I'll go to the map. I'll go here. Some of their superiors were very happy to spend the day in the hotel, but they were saying, we should be visiting schools, we should be visiting prisons, we should learn as much as we can and make this, display the might of Japan, was a quote I often saw. And so some of my favorite, historical sources, they took it into their own hands and would sneak out at night and go kind of try to find, meet people. They'd have secret conversations in people's homes. Some of the conversations were very strange. I mentioned this excitement for the Japanese, and one of the samurai, he was walking, and an American man is like, come, I have something to show you. And he goes, and the American man is just doing strength exercises in his home. And then the samurai writes like, iwakan nari, like it was very strange. So not all the fact finding was, useful, but there were some who saw this as very important. Another man named Oguri was very interested in visiting the mint and kind of trying to get a better understanding of Japanese currency versus American. But as a whole, they didn't have an agenda. And that's one reason why when they came to Japan, some of the discoveries that they made were kind of lost to history for some time, because there was this rush with all these other political problems and less of an idea of let's circle the wagons and gather what we learned. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you. I have two questions that I'm going to relay from folks watching on Zoom.
Oh, wonderful.
So the first one, do we know why in the beginning, like you showed the map of the entire journey, do we know why that they continued to go along around the world, basically take the long way home versus head back across the Pacific?
Yes, I believe this is an interest in actually seeing other places, getting to see more of the world. As I said, the scenic route. But it actually had quite a serious consequence by taking this long route. So on their way there, they had to stop at Hawaii, which, as I said, not a part of America at the time. They go to California, cross Panama by train, and go to America, and then they have this great welcome. But on their way back, they're essentially stopping at a variety of colonies, at places that have been kind of experiencing all sorts of kind of exploitative colonization, including, Luanda, now Angola, Chao Vicente, Indonesia, then Jakarta. And so on the way back, they had this kind of whirlwind of excitement for America. Some are very ready to go. Some have learned interesting things, a variety of responses. But on their way back, they get this kind of crash course in all the ways things can go wrong when you are engaging in diplomacy with European countries. So many of the samurai returned to Japan actually quite even more fearful about the future of Japan in connection with some of these Western countries, because they've seen firsthand the way that Chinese people are treated in Hong Kong, or Chinese immigrants in Hawaii, indigenous people in different places. So that hadn't been the goal of the trip, but it's a very interesting consequence.
Thank you.
Yes.
And the other question from Zoom was, do we know where Takeshi learned English?
Oh, yes. Wonderful, wonderful question. So, yes. So let me get back to a picture of him. So where did he go? Okay. Yes. So he came on the embassy as an unpaid assistant interpreter. His uncle. Oh, sorry. Was that me or was that you? I think I pressed something. If you don't mind, yeah, I'll just keep talking. Not a problem for me. So Takeshi Onojiro. So his uncle was the kind of one of the official interpreters for the embassy. He was kind of assistant, unpaid. His uncle / adopted father helped him get on board. But he had studied before with his uncle in the Nagasaki Naval Training School, because during this time, basically there's a realization that English is going to be a useful language in negotiating things like the Perry negotiations and things like that. And many involved with the Perry negotiations had connections to this 1860 embassy. So he had some practice before, and he also briefly worked as an interpreter in Yokohama, in one of these open ports, kind of helping sailors. And there's some wonderful records of him kind of engaging, and the captain of the Kanrin Maru, the other ship, commented that one of the men connected to the Kanrin Maru commented that when he was visiting someone, he was so excited that he greeted everyone with a "How do you do?" Of course, we don't know if he actually did, but from kind of pictures and other reports of his personality, I can believe that this was someone who was so excited to be interpreting and getting to speak English in Japan that he was very excited about this trip. Yeah, great question. And he continued to speak English. He would have a very interesting life after this, but a very exciting start to his studies. Any other questions?
My question was very similar, but just as a follow-up, so was the burden for interpretation all on the Japanese? Did anyone on the American side know Japanese before they came?
Yeah, excellent question. So during this time, in Japan, Dutch is still the predominant language that is used for negotiations. So many of these interpreters and the interpretation that was happening was going from Japanese to Dutch to English. Especially in the kind of very important, moments like the ratification of the treaty, things like that. So there was almost always a Dutch interpreter by. At this time, there was not going to be like what we would now want as a bilingual Japanese English, with the exception of the man that they sent back to Japan. I think it's really interesting to imagine how U.S.-Japanese history would have changed. So I mentioned this. So we have the Kanrin Maru, which is in California and then goes back. That shipwrecked teenager I mentioned at the beginning, who he was shipwrecked, a really incredible life, could be a whole nother talk, so I'll restrain myself. But he's basically rescued as a teen by an American whaling captain, and then he grows up in Connecticut. So he's essentially bilingual. He knows more about America and the English language, I would arguably say, than perhaps any of the other people. But he wasn't part of this official delegation, so you don't have that like perfect bilingual person there. So even the interpreters, Japan has, they had only been studying for many of them less than 10 years. So a lot of opportunities for misunderstandings and things to be lost in translation. But that's, I think, actually one reason why Tateishi was so popular was because he was not afraid to make mistakes. I say this to my students as well, which is a lot of times what makes language work in communication, it's not perfect grammar, it's that desire to communicate. And I think what people loved, let's go back and look at him again. What I think people loved about Tateishi was he was so excited to be in America. And as Americans are trying to show what they see as the best of themselves, it was very exciting for many to see this joy reflected in the enthusiastic assistant interpreter, Tateishi Onojiro.
Hi, you mentioned that Tateishi was brought up in the newspapers even throughout the Civil War.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that? Was it like updates about him, or is it just like still talking about his time when he was here in 1860?
Yes, thank you for the question. So updates, but I would want to add updates in quotes because as you can imagine, in American Civil War, there's not a direct link to what this now adult man is doing. So they did print updates, but these updates were largely fictional, and many of them quite mean, which is why I didn't want to go too much into them. But I'm very glad that this question was asked because it shows how much of a kind of threat some of these Japanese men were to ideas about American civilization that linked race and culture. So in the American Civil War, there were newspaper articles that would say quite nasty things about Tateishi, and talk about how we've done some follow-up research and we can tell you he was never a prince, and he's having these kind of living in this terrible little shack, and all you ladies, but you will regret that now. I'm paraphrasing, but but kind of those types of articles, kind of really trying to wheedle in and say, isn't this an embarrassing thing that we ever were so interested in him? But then they keep publishing them. And so it's very interesting. Some of them start changing the story. Sometimes he's doing quite well. Sometimes he's not doing quite well. And so clearly he's still existing in the back of people's minds in the American Civil War. Some people, amidst all this chaos, are wondering what happened to that Japanese prince. And then there are also, though, on the personal level, people who are just writing letters and actually very fondly recounting their, quote, flirtation with the Japanese prince. Whether it happened or not, I'm thinking of one man in particular who he was very proud of the fact that his wife, his fiance, his wife now, had some kind of encounter with Tommy. So both in a kind of negative way, but also a positive way, he still has this hold on American consciousness.
I think we have time for a couple more.
Were these folks part of future missions? I mean, were they taken seriously? I know there was a civil war and a lot
Yes.
changed with Japan. So what was their standing and their sort of seriousness in the whole scheme
Yeah.
of things?
Okay, great question. So some of them will actually, including Tadeishi, will come back to America on the next embassy. Unfortunately for Tadeishi, the excitement for him, in 11 years later, was not as much. No longer this kind of smiling teenager. Now he is a kind of a Civil War survivor. And so he has a very different experience. America has also changed and has less of this. What I kind of think of this as a very unsettled time in American ideas about Japan and civilization. By 1872, by the time they get to DC, ideas about Japan's place in the world had really settled. But these men do kind of participate in later embassies. Some of them fight, like Tadeishi, on the losing side of the Civil War, and that comes with all sorts of consequences. Some go on to kind of be great leaders. In particular, although he was on the other ship, the Kanrimaru has some of these men who become great intellectual heroes of 19th century Japan. So it's interesting thinking about how they all go off and have their own different adventures. But for Tadeishi, his 1860 trip is the one that stays with him forever. And he even names one of his daughters Tome.
Any other questions? Well, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. We do have one more.
I just had one based on the last point you made. I wondered if anything, did they bring anything back to Japan that they found interesting and sort of, it caught on with the Japanese, and they appropriated it and made it their own and changed, but it was a positive thing, maybe
Yes.
some little way of doing something or something like that.
Yes. So the great question. So one of the things that was brought back by some of the embassy members was a keen interest in American machinery. In particular, there's a story of one of the samurai named Oguri, and Oguri Tadamasa. I think I have a picture of him. We saw it before, but Oguri Tadamasa, and seeing this development. He was in that picture of the Navy Yard, seeing the machinery, and he will later on help build this kind of naval arsenal in Japan. And there's a story of him seeing a screw and taking that screw and taking it back with him in Japan. Many of these metals were very rare in Japan at the time. So the idea that you could walk down a street and there would be iron nails just popping out of railroads and things was very surprising to others as well in the embassy. So Oguri comes back with a extreme motivation to remake the kind of future of Japan, which he does. Yeah, great question. Oh, yeah.
Natalia, thank you very much.
Thank you.